We're back with more from our special Gender, the Space Between. I want to continue the conversation now by turning to our panel. Dr. John Steever, here on set, oversees the transgender health program at the Mount Sinai Adolescent Health Center. Campbell University law professor Greg Wallace is in Raleigh, North Carolina. And in Washington, D.C., Peter Sprigg is senior fellow for policy studies at the Family Research Council. And Sarah Warbelow is the legal director for the Human Rights Campaign. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Dr. Steever, let me start first with you in terms of the medical thinking around folks who are gender fluid or don't identify with a specific gender. Some folks say this connotes some sort of medical disadvantage, some kind of medical problem. What does science have to say?
It's absolutely not a medical disadvantage. This is just a normal variant of the human condition. There's no pathology here. There is not any disability here in any way. These are just individuals whose brains, their identification, their gender identity does not match their bodies. And there's really no pathology or problem with this. It's an unusual in terms of epidemiologic frequency, but it's not abnormal.
So the science, you say, is fairly settled on this being not a medical disadvantage.
That is correct.
Peter, I know that socially and culturally there's still a debate about this, though, and your organization calls the transgender movement, quote, an assault on the sexes. Tell us a little bit more about why you believe that.
Well, you know, it wasn't so many years ago that progressives were saying that gender is a social construct. I actually agree that gender is a social construct, which is why I think it's a less meaningful way of classifying people's identity than sex. Sex is a biological reality, something that in the vast majority of people is unambiguous and immutable from birth. And so I think the real conflict is not between people who believe in sort of traditional gender roles and those who believe in greater gender fluidity. It's between those of us who believe that sex is a more meaningful determinant of personal identity than gender, which is entirely subjective and psychological rather than objective and physical.
Well, all of those things come to a head when we're talking about policy making. And I want to turn to the so-called bathroom debate. HB 2 in North Carolina is about to mark 1 year as law. In part, it requires transgender people to use the bathrooms corresponding to the sex on their birth certificate. The ACLU is challenging this in federal court. Professor Wallace, you believe this challenge is likely to fail. Why is that?
First of all, I don't think there's any constitutional right for a transgender person to use the bathroom or locker room or changing facility of their choice. I mean, the reason we have separate bathrooms and changing facilities is to protect bodily privacy. There are specific constitutional protections that courts have recognized for bodily privacy. And the other argument that's being made is that under Title IX, the term sex should be interpreted as gender identity. There's no basis for that in the text of Title IX or the legislative history or the common understanding of that term. In fact, if you interpret sex as gender identity instead of the biological or anatomical differences, then I think you have a difficult time both under Title IX, which was originally devised to protect women's sports. I think you have a difficult time with actually protecting women's sports, and also I think in the employment context, if you lose the distinction between men and women, I think you lose some of the special protections that have been so hard fought for women over the last 50 years.
Sarah, what do you think of that the law is not in the same place where activists may be?
Well, I think there's a misunderstanding of how the law has been applied. Our nation's civil rights laws explicitly prohibit discrimination on the basis of sex. And to date, 5 of our federal circuit courts have understood those prohibitions to also apply to discrimination on the basis of gender identity. So, you know, nearly half of all of our federal circuit courts have made very clear that you cannot discriminate on the basis of gender identity. You cannot discriminate against transgender people.
Peter, back to you. Your organization thinks activists are setting themselves up for, quote, a gross overreach and a setback in the courts. Give us your thoughts on that.
Well, I agree with the professor, first of all, that laws prohibiting discrimination based on sex were intended to prohibit discrimination based on one's biological sex at birth. There has been an effort to sort of wedge in this concept of gender identity through a Supreme Court decision that said gender stereotyping could be a form of discrimination based on sex. But I think it's a huge leap to go from that to incorporating this whole idea of gender identity. So I think there is going to be there is a pushback, in part because this involves places that are very public yet at the same time private. The reason why we have separate men's rooms and women's rooms, for example, or separate locker rooms and showers in our schools for the boys and the girls is not because they have different gender identities. It's because they have different bodies. And it is, as the professor said, their bodily privacy that we are interested in protecting. And that just goes out the window if you adopt the gender identity approach instead of a biological sex approach.
Dr. Steever, let me go back to you from a medical standpoint. Mm-hmm. We're talking here now about gender identity and sex, and is there a difference as we're talking about human biology?
I think there is a difference between gender identity and sex, especially if you look at some of the studies for children and adults who were born intersexed. We are not necessarily a binary organism. It's not all boys, all girls. There are people who are in between. If you're just looking even at their physical bodies, and then you apply that construct to gender, and you can see how there's a fluidity and a spectrum there. And to force people who have done, say, transitioning, mm-hmm. Either partially or fully, to use a space where they are definitely uncomfortable seems to be a perversion of some of these laws and rules.
I want to talk a little bit about more where we are in terms of rules and laws, where society has to sort of make a decision or not, one way or the other. And first, I want to play a short remark by former Vice President Joe Biden during his acceptance speech of a humanitarian award. The former Vice President addressed transgender issues. Let's take a look.
There's a change in the landscape out there, folks. So, Gov, you and I, your sister and everyone in this room, we have a hell of a lot of work to do. There are those attempting to shift the focus. For example, instead of focusing on the fact that 40% of the homeless youth on the street are identified as lesbians, gay, bisexual, and transgender, rejected by their families out in the street. And what do we do about that? We're now focusing on whether or not a transgender child, which bathroom they can use.
Sarah, that changing landscape that former Vice President Biden refers to is a not so subtle reference, of course, to the Trump administration. His remarks came after the administration withdrew Obama-era guidance for transgender students. What impact is that practically having, and how do you look at the sort of landscape politically at this moment?
Yeah. Look, it's incredibly sad that the Trump administration decided to target young trans kids as one of its first actions in the new administration. But I want to be clear, that does not change the underlying law that prohibits discrimination on the basis of gender identity. In addition to Title IX, there are 14 states plus the District of Columbia that have very explicit prohibitions on discrimination based on gender identity. We need to make sure that our trans youth are being supported in their families and in their schools. You know, what we don't want to have happen is children being isolated. When children are separated out in the educational environment, they end up dropping out of school, and many of them do end up on the streets. You know, I think it's important for people to think about trans teenagers like Gavin Grimm, the young man who is at the heart of the case that went up before the Supreme Court and will likely reach the Supreme Court again. He's a boy, And asking him to use the girls' restroom is not only uncomfortable and frankly dangerous for him, it's uncomfortable for his female classmates. He is a boy and he belongs in the boys' restroom.
Let me ask you really quickly, Professor Wallace, before we go, where do you see, Sarah seems to think that the cases, Gavin Grimm's case, will return to the Supreme Court. What is your thinking on that?
I would not be surprised if in the Fourth Circuit that the Fourth Circuit, because of the very left or liberal-leaning justices that are there in that circuit, that the Grimm case would result in a victory for Mr. Grimm, and then would wind up back at the Supreme Court. But I think that once the Trump administration has drawn the very tenuous base guidance and fairly anti-democratic kind of guidance that the Obama administration gave by simply imposing it through these letters without going through the rulemaking process. I think once that's gone, it's going to be a very much of an uphill battle for Mr. Grimm to win. I wouldn't be surprised, though, if he did win in the Fourth Circuit. Whether he will win in the Supreme Court is another matter entirely.
An ongoing conversation and an ongoing set of questions. Dr. Steever, Professor Wallace, Sarah Warbelow, and Peter Sprigg, thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.